Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today we're really digging into the ideas presented by Dr. Satinder Singh Malik in his work, The Real Constitution of India 1.3. Our goal, basically, is to pull out the key threads of his thinking. We're looking at India's philosophical heritage, how he sees the current constitution, and where things might go next.
And what's interesting right off the bat is the author himself, his journey, from the Indian Air Force into philosophy, spirituality. It gives him a very particular perspective.
It really does. And that perspective leads him to argue that the current constitution is, well, heavily influenced by Western philosophy.
Right. His main thrust, as I read it, is a call for a constitution that feels more connected to India's own sort of ancient wisdom.
Exactly. And for you, listening, what we want to do is unpack his core arguments. We'll explore the history and philosophy he lays out, looking for those moments that really make you think about, the foundations of government and society.
Those aha moments.
Precisely.
Okay.
All right, let's jump in. So the author kicks things off by highlighting India's historical weight. We're talking Indus Valley civilization.
The cradle of innovation, really.
Yeah, and major contributions, like in mathematics. The point being, there's this long, deep history of intellectual and cultural energy.
And it wasn't just internal. He really stresses how India was this magnet, drawing travelers, scholars for centuries. People like Fahin, Huayin Singh.
Megasthenes, Al-Biruni.
Marco Polo, even.
Right, and their writings consistently mention the spirituality, the culture, the economy, the knowledge systems. It paints a picture of a very self-assured civilization.
Confident in what it was offering the world. William Dalrymple's quote comes to mind about ancient India being a confident exporter of its diverse civilization, creating this Indosphere.
Yeah, that sets a powerful context.
It does. And then the author pivots to discuss the impact of, well, external forces, particularly Western thought and colonialism.
He flags Vasco da Gama's arrival in 1498 as key, driven by trade spices, mostly, but also, religious aims, spreading Christianity. So the start of a major outside influence.
Precisely. And while he acknowledges the earlier Muslim invasions, Dr. Malik seems to view the European cultural influence as particularly persistent, burdening even.
That's the sense I got, too. Like it had a more continuous shaping effect on the nation's identity as he sees it.
And he also briefly mentions India's economic path after independence, suggests that maybe the inward-looking policies held back growth compared to more export-focused countries.
Just a side point, but relevant to how history shapes things.
Yeah, policy choices matter long-term.
Okay, this leads us to a really core distinction he makes. Civilizational versus universal philosophies. What's the essence of that?
So the way Dr. Malik explains it, civilizational philosophy is really embedded in one culture, its history, its values, its stories.
Okay.
To make sense elsewhere, it often needs, well, adapting.
Translation almost.
Kind of, whereas a universal philosophy aims for truths that ideally work across cultures. They tap into something basic about being human, so they tend to resonate more easily, he suggests.
And he feels Indian philosophy, especially Vedanta, leans more towards direct experience, personal realization.
Exactly. More about that inner knowing, less purely about intellectual debate, though that exists too, of course.
Right.
He emphasizes how holistic Indian thought often is, spiritual, ethical, practical, all woven together. Think about dharma.
Yeah, that's a huge concept, not just duty.
No, it's way bigger. Responsibilities, ethics, social role, even cosmic order. Understanding his take on dharma is pretty crucial for his later critique. He also makes this interesting point about desire, not just necessity, driving innovation in Indian thinking.
Okay, so with that philosophical background set up, he then turns his critical eye to the current Indian constitution. His argument is that its reliance on European philosophical models makes it feel, well, disconnected from India's own traditions.
He even questions if India is truly a republic in the deepest philosophical sense, guided by dharma and the common good as he understands them.
And he has this intriguing idea about Western constitutions having a kind of dual nature.
Yeah, the worldly front, the text itself, but also a background, often rooted in religious texts like the Bible, providing a sort of moral anchor.
And he suggests the Indian constitution lacks that specific grounding in India's own philosophical soil.
Right. He then quickly traces its history, the British Acts, the formation of the Indian National Congress.
Mentions Alan Octavian Hume, his Theosophical Society connection too.
And he points out that even Dr. Ambedkar, the chief architect, acknowledged borrowing ideas from other constitutions, which is normal, of course, but fits his narrative.
Sure.
Then he introduces this phrase, a culture of constitutionalism, meaning just following the book. He contrasts that with what he sees as older, grassroots democratic traditions in ancient India.
Indianness and Sanghas.
Exactly, those tribal republics, assemblies, more participatory, he argues.
Okay, shifting to democracy itself. He notes its Greek origins, briefly,
Standard stuff.
and acknowledges modern Indian democracy. Representative, universal suffrage, multi-party system.
But then comes the critique. He talks about the self-serving pillars of democracy: legislature, executive, judiciary, media.
Oof, that's pretty strong.
It is. He voices concerns about corruption, about these pillars potentially serving their own interests or party interests over the public good.
And he names specific issues. The politics, crime nexus, vote bank politics.
Dynastic politics, too. It's a very frank assessment of the challenges.
But he doesn't paint a completely bleak picture, does he?
No, not at all. He also acknowledges India's incredible resilience as this huge, diverse democracy.
What does he attribute that resilience to?
Several things. Some selfless leaders, he says, a disciplined military, honest officers, the cultural richness of the people, and this underlying philosophy of Sanatana.
That eternal Dharma idea again.
Yeah, so it's a view that sees both the problems and the strengths holding it together.
Let's move on to justice. The Constitution aims for social, economic, political justice, right, addressing historical wrongs.
That's the goal, yes. He outlines the court system structure, its British common law inheritance, briefly touches on the history of law from Hammurabi onwards.
Standard background. But then he raises concerns about the current system in India.
He does. He talks about delays, the slowness of justice.
That's a common complaint.
And the cost, which can make it inaccessible. Also a perception of leniency sometimes, and maybe some resistance to reform within the judiciary itself.
He also mentions the process for removing judges' impeachment, and notes it rarely happens.
Right. And he points to some recent Supreme Court actions. He specifically mentions a case involving the President and the Walk Amendment Act 2025 that have fueled debate about potential judicial overreach. It's about the boundaries of power.
Okay. Now, those big French Revolution ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, how does he view them in the Indian context?
Well, with liberty, his take is interesting. He suggests that in a nation that is already free and democratic, maybe liberty isn't the same kind of revolutionary cry. It's more of a given baked into the constitutional rights.
Less of a struggle, more of a foundation?
Perhaps. But it's his take on equality that's quite layered.
How so?
He questions this idea of simple, absolute equality between everyone. He points to obvious differences in learning, motivation, background.
Like comparing a top scientist to someone illiterate, or a billionaire to someone destitute.
Exactly. Or even a humanitarian versus a criminal. His point is that these differences are real.
So what's his alternative then?
He suggests thinking about equality of status as something linked more to what individuals achieve and contribute, rather than a flat, abstract ideal.
Okay. And fraternity?
For him, that's more of a moral feeling, an obligation that has to come from the people themselves. It can't really be legislated, he thinks. It's organic.
Got it. Let's talk sovereignty and secularism now. Popular sovereignty, power with the people. National sovereignty, the nation's independence.
Right. And Dr. Malik explores how these can sometimes be in tension. National sovereignty can be challenged, he argues, by internal divisions, like factionalism.
And external factors, too.
Yeah, things like global ideologies, religious movements, crossing borders, economic dependence, even media influence from abroad. Information warfare, essentially.
Then he turns to secularism in India. He notes it was added to the Constitution, 42nd Amendment.
And the common phrase, sarva dharma samabhava, equal respect for all religions.
But he has a critique here, too, doesn't he?
He does. He questions the practice of using religion to define permanent minority groups. He worries this can actually deepen divisions and become a tool in politics.
Making religion a polarizing factor.
Potentially, yes. And he briefly mentions the whole debate around a uniform civil code, one law for personal matters, regardless of religion. It's tied into this.
Okay, so now he starts looking at alternatives, maybe a modified democracy for India. He mentions the directive principles.
Those guiding principles for the state. And the basic structure doctrine, the idea that some core parts of the Constitution can't be changed even by Parliament.
Right. He also lists several historical agreements and treaties. Panchil, Indus Waters, Tashkent.
Simla Agreement, Kachativu, Cocoa Islands. His point seems to be that these are examples where, in his view, executive decisions might have overstepped or perhaps weren't in India's best long-term interest. It fuels his argument about the current system's flaws.
So, summing up his analysis, he concludes, India isn't quite a republic in his philosophical ideal.
But more of a modified democratic system, and this is where he flights some really different ideas.
Like the family-centric voting.
Yeah, where maybe the head of the family gets one vote for everyone. It's quite radical. And also the idea of a weighted franchise.
Meaning?
Linking voting power somehow to a person's contribution to society. It's an old idea, debated for centuries, but he brings it up as an alternative to just one person, one vote.
And he also talks about political parties. Not just reflecting divisions, but maybe creating and using them.
Right. Actively constructing divisions for political advantage is his argument.
To give all this a deeper philosophical grounding, he brings in Plato's Republic.
Says reading it was a big moment for him. He touches on Plato's ideas about justice, the ideal state, the philosopher king.
The theory of forms, how states decay, democracy, oligarchy, democracy, tyranny.
And the immortality of the soul. He connects these classical ideas to his own vision for a constitution rooted in India's heritage.
Which leads him to propose his principles for a real Constitution of Bharat.
Yeah, a set of core ideas. Things like legitimacy coming from consent and service to the people, accountability, fairness.
Structured governance, checks and balances, protecting citizens' rights.
Fostering prosperity, but also acknowledging human flaws and maybe a higher purpose. It's a broad philosophical framework.
He then circles back to really emphasize India's own vast philosophical heritage. Quotes Will Durant.
Motherland of our race, mother of our philosophy. He lists the diverse schools, Vedanta, Yoga, Samkhya, Nyaya.
Jainism, Buddhism, Charvaka. This is a huge list.
And key Vedic concepts, the Purusharthas, Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha, the four aims of life.
And the ashrama system, the stages of life.
Right.
Moksha, Rahasya.
Vanaprastha, Sannyasa, plus karma and prem universal love.
He also introduces that microcosm macrocosm idea. Yat pinditat brahmande.
As is the individual, so is the universe. He uses it to think about how individuals, groups, nations are all interconnected, reflecting similar patterns.
And contrasts total liberty with Sishta self-limiting behavior. Uses that disturbing rhythm as art experiment as a warning.
Yeah, about what can happen with unchecked freedom without inner control. He stresses aligning with nature, physical, psychological, social for well-being.
So based on all this, he proposes a new governance structure.
Quite different.
Very different. Based on Vedic ideas like Purusha and Prakriti and that microcosm-macrocosm principle, he suggests a presidential council of 5 philosopher leaders.
Philosopher leaders.
Yeah. Supported by a merit-based presidential secretariat. National existence is primary, protected by the armed forces.
And then this parliament of the wise, how would that work?
Selected, not elected in the usual way. Based on IQ, EQ emotional intelligence, and a proven service orientation. Plus rigorous training. Wow. That's a departure. What about state assemblies?
They'd still have a role, and he emphasizes the family system as crucial.
He also suggests justice system reforms based on Indian logic, not just Greek logic.
Right. He sees Greek logic as often binary true-false. Indian logic, he says, is more multi-valued, contextual, ethical.
So the reforms would involve
holistic reasoning, better fact-finding, flexible sentencing focused on rehabilitation, more alternative dispute resolution.
maybe older, wiser judges from the Vanaprastha stage, and reviving Dharma Panchayats.
Exactly. Legal education reform, too. A whole overhaul based on different principles.
Then there's this idea to fight democratic amnesia, forgetting the past. NIRE.
National Information Retrieval Establishment, basically a state memory bank.
To archive, analyze, share critical info so mistakes aren't repeated.
Yeah. He mentions things like the Waqf Act, Tashkent Agreement, issues he feels faded from proper scrutiny, and NIRE would track this stuff. Data acquisition, analysis, dissemination.
He keeps coming back to Dharma, the essence of good thought. Duty, righteousness, ethics, order.
It's central. He links it to modern problems like addiction, distraction, even brings in Plato's ideas about shaping society's influences for the better.
And finally, finance, tackling corruption, illicit economies.
Yeah. Proposes strengthening anti-corruption bodies, better oversight, tax reforms, tackling the black economy, breaking corrupt networks, transparency.
Even suggests a centralized tax linked to currency use, maybe taxing cash withdrawals, giving notes a limited lifespan.
Ideas to push towards digital transactions and reduce unaccounted money. It's all part of a package of reforms.
He wraps up by noting how complex modern governance is: technology, globalization, activism.
Foreign interference, all making it harder. And he stresses that need to balance economic goals, Artha, with moral duty, Dharma.
Okay, so drawing this deep dive together, We've covered a lot of ground, from India's ancient philosophy to a pretty radical vision for its future governance.
It's definitely a thought-provoking journey through Dr. Malik's ideas in the Real Constitution of India 1.3.
For me, the standouts were that sharp critique of the Western influence on the Constitution. Those proposals, like the Parliament of the Wise, weighted franchise, very unconventional, and the idea of a justice system based on Indian logic.
What struck me most was that constant thread trying to connect modern problems back to India's own philosophical resources. It makes you ask, have we overlooked valuable wisdom from our own heritage in the rush to adopt other models?
That's a great point. And now, turning it over to you, listening. What are your takeaways? Could delving deeper into India's philosophical roots, as Dr. Malik Ezekias, offer a path to a more, maybe just and effective governance for the 21st century?
Which parts of his argument resonated most? Or perhaps what parts felt challenging? What new questions does it spark for you about how a nation should ideally be structured?
Definitely a lot to think about there. A really rich set of ideas.